and welcome to tonight's lecture on our current exhibition, Divine Encounter, Rembrandt's Abraham and the Angels. I'm Susan Galassi, Senior Curator at the Frick Collection, and it's my great privilege to introduce the show's curator, Joanna Seidenstein, a cherished and highly respected colleague to all of us here at the Frick. Joanna is the Frick's Anne L. Poulet Curatorial Fellow and will be completing her 2-year term in August. She is now finishing her doctoral dissertation on Rembrandt's classical subjects at the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University, under the supervision of Professor Marriott Westerman. This fall, she will begin an Andrew W. Mellon Fellowship at the Metropolitan Museum in the Department of Prints and Drawings. Joanna's current exhibition is the culmination of a very impressive list of accomplishments during her tenure at the Frick, preceding her fellowship. She was a valued collaborator on various exhibitions, among them Whistler, Goya, and Picasso, while completing her coursework at the Institute. Joanna's contributions to the conception, research, and content of these exhibitions and their catalogs was fundamental to their success. During these years, Joanna also organized or co-curated exhibitions of her own on landscape drawings, Rembrandt and his school from the Fritz Luke collection, and Whistler in the Frick collection. Recently, Joanna joined Ian Worrell and me as co-curator of Turner's Modern and Ancient Ports, Passages Through Time. In a brilliant essay for the catalog, Joanna tackled the fascinating issue of Turner's classical harbors and organized an enlightening study day for fellow Turner experts. Working with Joanna from the inception of the show to its closing in May was one of the most fulfilling experiences of my years at the Frick. Alongside her work at the Frick, Joanna has established herself as a leading young scholar in the field of Dutch art. She has produced articles for the Journal of the Historians of Netherlandish Art and delivered papers at the Renaissance Society of America and at a conference of the historians of Netherlandish art. One of the things that I have most admired about Joanna is her fearlessness in taking on deep philosophical topics and ability to bring new insights into them. Her dossier exhibition is a perfect example. Through a small, luminous painting by Rembrandt and related works, she explores such themes as the interchange between the human and the divine, father-son relations, and the nature and limits of perception, all through the focus of the moving Abraham story as told in Genesis. A subtle interpreter of Rembrandt's narrative manner, Joanna brings to life for us the whole cast of characters, Hagar and Ishmael, Sarah and Isaac, and Abraham himself and the divine beings he encounters, as vividly filtered through the imagination of the great Dutch master. This lecture is being made possible by the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And now, please join me in welcoming Joanna Seidenstein to the podium.
Thank you so much, Susan, for that kind and generous introduction and for so much more over the course of my wonderful years here at the Frick. I'd also like to thank Adrian Lay, Persephone Allen, and Vincent Tolentino for their organization of this lecture, and all of my colleagues here at the Frick with whom it has been a very great privilege to work. Revelation, the disclosure of God's word and will, occurs throughout the Hebrew Bible and in a variety of ways, through visions and dreams, through God's angels, in the Hebrew malachim, literally messengers, and, not least, through direct communication between mortals and the Lord himself. At times, the text even seems to describe the presence of God on earth. What this contact between the earthly and the heavenly meant, and how to rectify it with an understanding of the ineffable, transcendental nature of the divine, continually intrigued Rembrandt, who, in 1646, produced this innovative treatment of divine revelation. The glowing creature at the center of this painting, the Lord in angelic form, appears to dematerialize into light before our eyes, transforming from mortal flesh into the immaterial presence of the otherworldly. One of the smallest paintings Rembrandt ever produced, in actuality only about 8.5 inches wide, and thus enlarged here to a rather obscene degree, this work depicts the foretelling of the birth of Isaac from chapter 18 of the book of Genesis. This enigmatic episode begins with the explicit statement that the Lord appeared to Abraham. It then proceeds to recount the visit of 3 men, travelers to whom Abraham offers his hospitality, inviting them for a meal and providing water so that they may wash their feet. While eating, one of the guests asks after Abraham's wife, Sarah, and announces that she will have a child in a year's time. Listening from the doorway, the woman, already in her 90s, laughs in disbelief until it is revealed that these visitors are messengers of the Lord, or, according to the predominant Christian interpretation, God himself accompanied by 2 angels. This tale of false appearances, doubt, and delayed discovery offered Rembrandt a vehicle through which to explore the psychological experience of revelation, what it means to be in the presence of the divine, and how the human mind perceives and processes the miraculous. This painting is one of several works in which Rembrandt depicted the biblical figure Abraham, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the progenitor of the Jewish people. In Genesis, he is the individual with whom God makes his everlasting covenant, promising descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. The patriarch's story was popular among artists working in the predominantly Calvinist society of the Dutch Republic. Rembrandt's recurrent and deepening interest in the story over the course of a 20-year period, however, indicates that it held special appeal for him. For the artist, Abraham's various encounters with God and his angels, confrontations between the earthly and the ethereal, the material and the immaterial, were fascinating pictorial challenges, and all the more so in light of Calvinism's prohibition against corporeal representations of God, which Rembrandt evidently viewed less as a mandate and more as a continual prompt to devise new means for representing the divine and its perception. Rembrandt's first depiction of Abraham is this painting of 1635, one of his earliest history paintings on a monumental scale, now in the Hermitage. This work depicts the episode from Genesis 22, in which God tests Abraham by commanding him to sacrifice his beloved son, Isaac, only to send an angel to intervene at the last minute. In the biblical text, this messenger is described only as calling out to Abraham. But like many artists before him, Rembrandt depicted the scene as a physical and visual encounter. The elderly man looks directly at the angel. His face expresses surprise, registering his recognition of the creature's presence. His eyes are filled with tears, whether those he had shed in sorrow at the thought of taking his son's life, or those now of relief, or both at once. Most remarkably, as the angel grasps the man's wrist, Abraham drops his knife, which Rembrandt paints in mid-air, underscoring the instantaneity of the scene, as if the angel's appearance and Abraham's perception of it occur in the same single instant, frozen in time. A similar motif is seen in Rembrandt's slightly later painting of Christ's resurrection, in which one of a group of intensely startled soldiers drops his sword. It was about this work that the artist articulated his sole documented comment about his art making. In a letter of 1639 to Constantine Huygens, the secretary to Frederick Hendrik, the Prince of Orange, Rembrandt explained that in making this picture, he had endeavored to depict the most natural motions, referring undoubtedly to the physical movement and facial expressions that together convey the figure's immediate, visceral reaction to the sight of the miraculous. This is demonstrated perhaps even more vividly in this painting of Belshazzar's Feast, also from the mid-1630s, in which shock and fear cause figures to knock over vessels of water and wine, which appear to spill forth their contents as if captured in freeze frame. Such instantaneous reactions were, in the 1630s, how Rembrandt understood revelation. Arguably, this was what appealed to him about these subjects. In the 1646 painting, however, all such sudden motion vanishes. Now all is calm and hushed. There are no extreme facial expressions, no sudden movements of the body, nothing falls or spills. Abraham is in full control of the pitcher and dish in his hands. Having kneeled to wash his guest's feet, he simply pauses, his thumb steadily holding open the lid of the pitcher. Time is not frozen here. Instead, action is suspended as time itself appears to progress. Scholars have long observed a shift in Rembrandt's art of the 1640s toward this increasing calm and stillness. Ernst van de Wetering has noted that the changes the artist made in 1647 to his Susanna and the Elders in Berlin, begun nearly 10 years earlier, were aimed specifically at removing fleeting movements, such as a jar falling over and a swan flapping its wings in the water, elements that convey surprise at the sudden appearance of the two elders. Van de Wetering frames this effort on Rembrandt's part within a broader discourse surrounding questions of time in painting. The scholar quotes a French art treatise of 1635, which recounts a dialogue in which a collector asks why in a picture of a galloping horse, his artist friend had shown the animal restrained with a bit. The painter responds, "I did it deliberately, because with 2 leaps, the horse would have been off the road and out of the picture. So you see, I had to rein it back a little." This concern for plausibility of action in painting, in light of the duration and recurrence of the viewer's gaze, anticipates the 18th century theorist Gotthold Lessing's objection to the depiction of anything, quote, essentially transitory in art, including intense emotions. For Lessing, visual art was limited to the depiction of what he called pregnant moments, natural pauses in the narrative that allude to but do not show the fleeting climactic moments to come. This picture is itself a revision of Rembrandt's earlier approach, as emphatic a reversal of his 1635 painting as one could imagine. Painted 1 year before Rembrandt made his changes to the Susanna, this work is arguably the turning point in the artist's approach to pictorial time. The fact that it is a depiction of divine revelation is no coincidence. It was through such subject matter in which mortals find themselves in extreme circumstances that Rembrandt was able to examine the workings of the human mind and the ways in which its extended internal processes bring external action to a standstill. Genesis 18 itself, as we've seen, is characterized by duration. Instead of the sudden appearance of the divine, time elapses, a meal is enjoyed between the arrival of the guests and the disclosure of their true identity. The ambiguities of the biblical passage, moreover, made this episode anything but a straightforward scene of immediate revelation. Christian theologians had long puzzled over this biblical text, offering different interpretations, but generally agreeing that the three visitors were the Lord and two angels. In the 5th century, the influential theologian St. Augustine wrote that while Abraham saw three men, he immediately understood that he was in the presence of the Lord. Significantly, Augustine makes a distinction between physical sight and inner vision, between what Abraham saw with his eyes and what he knew with his heart. In the 16th century, however, the reformer John Calvin argued that Abraham would not have made his offer of sustenance to the three strangers if he had understood them to be divine. Calvin also emphasized the fact that God and his angels did not simply don the guises of travelers, but actually transformed themselves, inhabiting real human bodies. Following Calvin, the Dutch States Bible, a government-sponsored translation of the original Hebrew and Greek, first published in 1637, specified in a marginal note that the three visitors were two angels and the Lord himself, all of whom took human form for the duration of their visit. This would seem to answer all questions about what Abraham actually saw. But artists, faced with the task of putting this encounter in pictorial form, still had to decide whether to portray the visitors as they appeared or in a way that conveyed their actual divine nature. In spite, or perhaps because of the inherent challenges in depicting this episode, artists treated it with enormous frequency from the 4th century on, and particularly in the 16th and 17th centuries. These works almost invariably show three undifferentiated figures, sometimes with wings or halos, other times with no indication of their divine status. And among these works, I am showing Rembrandt's teacher, Peter Lastmann's version of the scene of 1616. A rare and remarkable exception to the tradition of three undifferentiated figures appears in one of the 5th century mosaics in the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. This mosaic contains 3 vignettes, each representing a different moment of Genesis 18. The visitor's arrival, Abraham asking Sarah to prepare the meal, and then immediately next to it, serving that meal to the 3 visitors while hearing the divine announcement of Isaac's birth. In each scene, all 3 visitors possess halos, but in the first vignette at top, one of them is distinguished from the others by an aura of light that encompasses his entire body, in anticipation of the luminous creature that sits at the center of Rembrandt's painting. Nevertheless, in this mosaic, and to my knowledge in all the many depictions of Genesis 18 that preceded Rembrandt's painting, the visitors appear either as divine beings or as mortals. Rembrandt was then the first to show these visitors transformation in progress. The figure with his back to the viewer, closest to the picture plane, largely retains the appearance of a traveler. His walking stick is laid beside him, and a dirty foot extends from beneath his robe. His wings are tucked behind his back, visible to us, but not to Abraham or Sarah, and light just grazes his forehead and cheek. To his left, the angel to his left raises his wing and receives more light, but he is eating, a sign, according to Calvin, of the flesh and blood form the divine could inhabit, and that's still in his mortal form. Finally, however, the radiant figure at the center of the painting spreads his wings, showing in vivid visual form the full unfolding of the revelation. This effect, one we could characterize as proto-cinematic, suggests that unlike the aforementioned 18th century theorist Gotthold Lessing, who framed his remarks about still versus fleeting moments as a question of visual art's limitations, Rembrandt had an ambition to transcend the perceived boundaries of the still image. To return to Abraham and Sarah and their lack of visible reaction, we can see that the light that underscores the gradual transformation of the three visitors travels across the scene, casting reflections on the bowl and pitcher held by Abraham, and shedding only the faintest glow on his body, while not reaching Sarah at all. Presenting them largely in shadow, Rembrandt portrays them as if on the cusp of enlightenment, positioned between darkness and light. They hear the words being uttered. Perhaps, in Rembrandt's interpretation, they even see the visitors transforming. But they do not yet grasp what is being revealed to them. The artist thus conveys a lapse or disconnect between sensory perception and cognition, exhibiting a completely new understanding of the most natural motions. Rembrandt identifies revelation as an intellectual process, not a sensory one. 10 years after making the painting, Rembrandt depicted the visitation scene in Genesis 18 a second time in this etching. Here, in contrast to the earlier painting, the artist now emphatically identifies one of the figures as the Lord himself, an iconographical change that indicates his further meditations on the nature of revelation as a non-visual experience, as I will explain. Rembrandt based the composition of this print on an early 17th century Mughal painting of 4 Sufi mystics, one of several Mughal works that the artist owned and copied in drawings in the mid-1650s. And I show that drawing here at center. The etching, however, is the only instance in which Rembrandt employed one of his Mughal paintings as a model for a finished work of art. And it's a subtle relationship, and of course, because the etching is printed, you're seeing in reverse what he had put on the copper plate, but you can see how this figure and the picture, which you see here as well, are transposed into the figure of Abraham here, and the other figures become the three visitors. In encountering this painting, Rembrandt must have noted its commonalities with his 1646 painting, both small-scale scenes featuring 4 figures around a meal service with a prominently placed pitcher, and although it's no longer visible in the Mughal work because of 18th century interventions, a tree at center. In the etching, Rembrandt adds a figure who is not present in either the Mughal work or in Rembrandt's earlier painting. Appearing at the very center of the image with his back to the viewer is Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn son, whom he had fathered with the slave Hagar. Ishmael's presence here, highly unusual if not unprecedented in a depiction of Genesis 18, serves to anticipate and foreshadow his eventual banishment, an eventual consequence of Isaac's birth. Later in Genesis, in chapter 21, Sarah becomes concerned for Isaac's inheritance and asks Abraham to cast both Ishmael and Hagar from their home. The patriarch resists until the Lord commands him to do as Sarah says, promising him that Ishmael too will become the father of a great nation, understood generally to refer to the residents of the Arab world and in Islamic tradition, specifically to the ancestral line of the Prophet Muhammad. Rembrandt took great interest in the figure of Ishmael, depicting the banishment scene in an etching of 1637 and in a drawing of the 1650s showing the scene that followed the banishment, in which the cast-out Hagar and Ishmael face desperation and death in the wilderness until their cries are answered by God and one of his angels. Rembrandt may even have been thinking of Ishmael's banishment and not Isaac's near sacrifice when he made this etching, showing Abraham holding a beloved son whom, as his knowing outward stare suggests, he will eventually lose. Rembrandt was probably already thinking about the consequences of Isaac's birth when he made his 1646 painting, as David DeWitt observed in 2006, hanging on the wall of the house, directly between the figure of God and Abraham, is a bow. See there, this being the conventional attribute of Ishmael, who, it is stated in the text of the Bible, will eventually become an archer and come to live in the wilderness of Paran. Here in the later etching, the inclusion of Ishmael himself at the very heart of the image carries additional significance. Intuitively, scholars have tended to view his placement with his back to the three divine visitors as an expression of his turning away from the faith. They therefore understand his inclusion as a foil for Sarah and for the son to whom she will imminently give birth. Given, however, the long-standing distrust of sight in matters of faith, and the fact that in the text of Genesis 18, Sarah is the one who is guilty of doubting, of disbelieving the divine announcement of Isaac's birth, I suggest that it is her gazing toward the visitors, her seeking to see, that constitutes a failure of faith in Rembrandt's interpretation. While Rembrandt places her in the shadowy depths of the doorway, Ishmael appears in the bright light of day. Looking away, he shows that he is not reliant on sight for his understanding of the announcement of Isaac's birth and its implications. Facing the wilderness with bow and arrow in hand, he effectively enacts his divinely ordained destiny in response. In this work, Rembrandt sets sight and faith in opposition, identifying physical or sensory vision as a kind of blindness or failure of inner vision. And between the two extremes, represented by Ishmael and Sarah, is Abraham. Looking down, averting his eyes from his guests, he slowly takes in the news they bring, while a subtle play of light and shadow, rendered with the velvety burr of a dry-point needle, dapples across the foreground. In my view, a naturalized version of the light in the 1646 painting that here very subtly suggests revelation in progress, but a revelation that now is purely non-visual in nature. In the 1650s, Rembrandt explored the disconnect between the sensory and the cognitive in depictions of yet other episodes from the Abraham narrative, as, for example, in two works in which he reprised the subject of Isaac's near sacrifice. In this drawing, the artist completely discards the graceful poses and flowing drapery of his 1635 painting, and instead emphasizes the violence of the scene. A frail Abraham, seen from the back, leans over Isaac's body, covering his son's mouth to stop his cries, but not blocking his eyes from the sight of the knife being brought to his throat. Abraham proceeds even as the angel places a hand on his head and calls out to him, as he is not yet cognizant of its presence. In the etching, Rembrandt transports certain elements from the drawing, such as the angel's open mouth and the dramatic stream of light that accompanies him, but now depicts the scene in accordance with an interpretation that held that Isaac was a willing participant in the sacrifice. Here he kneels cooperatively with his hands unbound, and Abraham covers only his son's eyes, a gesture more protective than violent. Unlike in the drawing, here Abraham is not completely senseless to the angel's intervention. He does react, turning his head and pausing in his action, knife in hand, his open mouth suggesting his confusion. Within the deep shadows surrounding his eyes, the whites of his eyes are discernible upon close inspection, but Abraham nevertheless seems not to see the angel. Instead, he seems to see through this angelic body to a ram that is almost hidden from our view, and it is extremely difficult to see, but you can perhaps in this detail make out the hind leg and tail and the face and turning around to face us completely in shadow. This animal, according to the passage in the Bible, is provided by the Lord ultimately as a replacement for Isaac in the sacrifice. In the text and in Rembrandt's image, the animal is the flesh and blood foil to the immaterial angel, whose presence Abraham does not perceive. Abraham's open mouth, again, conveys his momentary confusion. And as in Rembrandt's two depictions of Genesis 18, the patriarch only gradually takes in this divine intervention and its significance. Again, he is, in the artist's interpretation, suspended at the cusp of understanding, of revelation. The artist would take a similar approach in his slightly later St. Matthew and the Angel, in which a youthful angelic figure approaches the apostle from behind, places a hand on his shoulder, and whispers in his ear. Light washes over Matthew's face and his open book, and he touches his wrinkled hand to his chest in a gesture of understanding. The apostle thus receives the divine inspiration offered to him, on some level aware of the angel's presence, but seeing and sensing nothing. Similarly, in Rembrandt's Jacob wrestling with the angel of roughly the same period, the artist shows Jacob with closed eyes, as if the angel, who is described in the Bible as a man, but is generally understood to have been God himself, as if he does not exist in the realm of the sensory. In all of these works, Rembrandt is getting at the idea of cognizance independent of sight, a distinction between the eye, the body and the mind, the eye and the intellect. Rembrandt situates the angels in the realm of the immaterial, while the mortals in these works possess varying degrees of awareness of their presence. In these explorations, the artist brings to mind the mind-body dualism of Cartesian philosophy. In his Discourse on the Method, published in 1637, the French-born philosopher and resident of the Dutch Republic, René Descartes, articulated a distinction between the body and the mind, between the senses and the intellect, specifically with regard to proving the existence of God. For Descartes, doubt in God was the product of the failure to distinguish between the physical and the immaterial, and of the resulting reliance on the senses for knowledge. He writes, "But what convinces many people that there is a problem in knowing him, God, and even of knowing what their soul is that they never raise their mind above the realm of sensory things, and are so used not to think of anything except by imagining it, which is a mode of thinking peculiar to material objects, that everything which seems unimaginable seems to them unintelligible." This is clear enough from the maxim that there is nothing in the intellect which has not previously been in the senses. However, it is certain that the ideas of God and soul have never been in the senses. There is no evidence that Descartes and Rembrandt ever met, but they could not have failed to have been aware of each other and each other's work. So rapidly were Descartes' ideas taken up in academic circles in the Dutch Republic that there were already calls to ban the teaching of Cartesianism at some of its universities by the early 1640s. It may also be worth noting that in the 1630s, Descartes was in contact with Constantijn Huygens, the man to whom Rembrandt had written about his interest in the most natural motions. Descartes' discussion might seem a rejection of any attempt to portray the divine in visual form. Yet Rembrandt, whether through exposure to Descartes or through his own meditations on the subject, deploys the idea of two separate realms, the material sensory world and the immaterial spiritual world, to free himself to give the divine vivid visual form. In this work, these two realms of reality are underscored by the hybrid nature of the two angels. The seemingly incongruous combination of their angelic wings and their distinctive masculine features and facial hair suggests that they are at once both the men Abraham sees with his eyes and the divine figures he is beginning to understand them to be. The figure of God functions similarly. His outward signs of divinity are not physical realities, but expressions of his true, invisible nature, perceptible to the mortals in the scene only through their inner vision. Nevertheless, the explicit representation of the Lord is surprising. It is true that in spite of the Calvinist prohibition against such anthropomorphic portrayals, they were not unheard of in 17th century Dutch art. We see them, to name just one example, throughout Crispijn de Pas's Genesis series, 1612. More often, however, from the later 16th century on, artists in the northern Netherlands studiously avoided such imagery, often replacing likenesses of the Lord with the tetragrammaton, the Hebrew name for God, or, as in this work by Peter Lastman, depicting another of God's appearances to Abraham, with light as a stand-in for the Almighty. Rembrandt himself in 1636 painted over an image of God the Father that he had initially included in the Ascension he painted for the Prince of Orange. In the 1650s, however, Rembrandt took a renewed interest in the corporeal representation of the Lord. In this exploratory drawing, he thinks through the third of God's appearances to Abraham in Genesis, the momentous episode of Genesis 17, in which God establishes his covenant with Abraham, who in the text falls on his face in response. Here, Rembrandt shows Abraham fully prostrate, his face buried in his hands, as if he is physically unable to look at God. This motif of the Lord carried by two angels or cherubs ultimately derives from Raphael, later prince, after whose work I show here. And they were also picked up by various other artists in the 16th and early 17th centuries, such as Martin van Heemskerk, in this depiction of Genesis 17. Rembrandt employs the same iconography in his drawing, but remarkably, in a related study dedicated to the figural group, seems to take pains to convey the weight of God's body. In other words, a material expression of this most immaterial being. Rembrandt's interest in the portrayal of a physical God in the 1650s could possibly relate to the contemporary activity of an interfaith group of millenarians, Jewish and Christian theologians who believed in the imminent coming of the Messiah. As Michael Zell has discussed, writings by the prominent Amsterdam Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel and by his Protestant colleague Paul Felgenhauer both invoke the story of Abraham, in part in response to the Apostle Paul's commentary in Galatians. There, Paul associates Ishmael and Hagar with those who did not accept Christ and, in his view, thus turned their backs on the Messiah and on the faith. The apostle presents Hagar, a slave, as an allegory for those still bound by Jewish law, while Sarah, the free woman, stands for those liberated from the law through their faith in Christ. In his text of 1655, Felgenhauer called for a rapprochement between Jews and Christians, both of whom could, in his words, possess the spirit, faith, and obedience of Abraham, one in one. Manasseh ben Israel, in his own messianic text of that same year, the Piedra Gloriosa, or glorious stone, also invoked Genesis 18 as a vehicle for affirming the Lord's promise to Abraham that, quote, all the families of the earth shall be blessed in thee and in thy seed. Rembrandt was certainly familiar with Manasseh's text, having produced a set of 4 illustrations for at least certain copies of the book, including the one owned by the scholar Isaac Vossius, to whom Manasseh dedicated the book. Whether or not Manasseh commissioned the illustrations has been much debated in recent years, but in my view, there is still good reason to believe that he did. And in any case, it is clear that Rembrandt became familiar with this messianic text in making these images. Notably, one of these illustrations, Daniel's vision of the 4 beasts, includes a representation of God in accordance with the description in the book of Daniel of the Ancient of Days, the basis, in fact, for standard Western iconography for the depiction of God the Father. In making this etching just 1 year later, Rembrandt could not have failed to take an interest in the implications of the contemporary millenarian discourse for his understanding of Abraham and his 2 sons, and for the representation of God on earth. That Rembrandt was actively thinking about such questions in these years finds some support in the works of his pupils. For example, Nicholas Maas, who trained with Rembrandt sometime between 1646 and 1653, produced these 2 drawings depicting the moment in Genesis 18 in which the 3 strangers first arrive and Abraham greets them. In a compositional study in red chalk, you can see him rethinking one of the 3 guests, enlarging him, changing the costume, the results of which become clear in this more developed sheet, which is in reverse. And this figure, you can see, closely resembles the figure of God in Rembrandt's etching. Whether Maas made these drawings under Rembrandt's supervision or later in independent consultation with his former master's etching is not known, but it does suggest a shared preoccupation. A broader interest in questions about sight and its role or lack thereof in perceiving divine presence can also be discerned in the work of yet other artists who passed through Rembrandt's studio in the 1640s, 50s, and 60s. Karl Fabricius's painting of Hagar in the wilderness suggests, through the placement of the figures and the lack of visual contact between them, that the angel is not truly present, but only an expression of the divine providence she experiences. This untraced work attributed to Ertehelder of Isaac's near sacrifice, quite similar to Rembrandt's drawing of the subject, omits the angel altogether, showing Abraham looking upwards, perhaps listening, or perhaps just meditating on the word of God. These are just a few examples of a preponderance of works that altogether suggest a larger dialogue among artists in Rembrandt's circle, who, as visual artists, were in a privileged position to contribute to theological and philosophical discussions about the role of sight and the sensory. The works produced by Rembrandt and his colleagues from the 1640s onward demonstrate an increasingly non-literal understanding of the divine encounters described in the Bible, framing the scenes as expressions of the internal, invisible, and even silent nature of communication between mortals and the divine. In the 17th century, this was a radical approach to biblical exegesis, but it was ultimately grounded in long-held ideas about faith. In about 1659, Rembrandt made a final image of Abraham, revisiting the subject of Isaac's near sacrifice in the form of a now really completely imperceptible, but trust me, it's there, image that hangs on the wall behind this image of the Apostle Paul. With this image within an image, Rembrandt alludes to Paul's epistle to the Hebrews, in which he emphasizes Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son as an example of his unshakable faith in God. The apostle begins this passage with the remark, "Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." For Rembrandt, an artist who frequently engaged with themes of sight, blindness, voyeurism, these words offer the ultimate artistic challenge to represent in visual form that which cannot be seen. Through his sustained engagement with the Abraham narrative, and particularly through his depictions of Genesis 18, possibly informed by his engagement with Cartesian philosophy, Rembrandt examined and re-examined the nature of revelation and negotiated the complexities of representing it in visual form. Thank you.